The studio lights were warm, not too bright, casting a soft glow over the set. It was late, past 10, but the audience didn't seem tired. They leaned forward in their seats, quiet, listening. On the couch sat Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a dark sweater, his posture relaxed but attentive. He wasn't there to sell anything flashy, just a new film, one about ordinary people facing impossible choices. The kind of story he's always been drawn to. The host, easygoing and curious, had steered the conversation away from box office numbers and special effects. Instead, they were talking about what keeps people going when everything feels uncertain. "You've been through a lot," the host said gently. "Loss, fame, the noise of it all. How do you stay grounded?" Reeves took a breath. He's never one to rush an answer. His eyes flickered slightly, as if scanning some internal horizon before speaking. "I try to remember that most of us are just doing our best," he said, "and that kindness matters more than we think." The audience murmured in agreement. It wasn't a rehearsed line. It sounded lived in, like something he'd learned not from a script but from years of walking through life with his eyes open. Then the host asked, almost casually, "Have you been keeping up with anything happening in the world lately? Anything that's caught your attention?" Most guests would have mentioned a trending show, a political headline, or maybe a sports win, but Reeves paused again, long enough that you could feel the room lean in. "Yeah," he said finally. "I saw that Cardinal Robert Prevost was elected Pope." Silence. Not awkward, but surprised. A few people exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual territory for a Hollywood interview. "He seems thoughtful," Reeves continued, his voice low but clear. "A quiet man doing quiet work in a loud world." That was it. No grand declaration, no attempt to explain theology or make a statement. Just a simple observation, offered like a small gift. But in that moment something shifted. You could feel it, even through the screen later when millions watched the clip online. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. There was no performance in it, no agenda. Just genuine respect, spoken plainly. Back in the studio, the host blinked, then smiled. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, laughing softly. "But it makes sense coming from you." Reeves gave a small shrug, almost embarrassed. "I just noticed it, and it felt important." The interview moved on, to the film, to his co-stars, to his love of motorcycles. But that one moment lingered in the air like the last note of a song. People kept thinking about it long after the credits rolled. By midnight, the clip was already spreading. First on Twitter, then Instagram, then news sites. "Keanu Reeves praises new Pope in surprise interview," read one headline. Another, "Why Keanu's Pope comment is going viral." Comments poured in, some joking, some deeply moved. "Only Keanu would bring up the Pope like it's the most natural thing in the world," one person wrote. Another said, "He didn't say much, but it felt like he said everything. What made it so striking wasn't the mention of the Pope itself. It was the tone." In a world where public figures often speak to be heard, to provoke, or to trend, Reeves spoke like someone who simply wanted to acknowledge something good, without needing credit for noticing it. Outside the studio, the city hummed with its usual chaos, cars honking, people rushing home, neon signs flickering. But inside that quiet exchange, something rare had happened, a moment of sincerity that didn't feel staged or calculated. Just human, and that's what people connected with. Over the next few hours, journalists scrambled. Who was Robert Prevost? Why would Keanu know his name? Prevost, an American-born Augustinian friar, had just become the first U.S. citizen elected, Pope in modern history, a quiet scholar who'd spent decades working in Peru, listening more than speaking, serving more than leading. He wasn't a media personality. He hadn't courted attention. In fact, he'd spent most of his life avoiding it. Yet here was one of the most famous actors in the world, mentioning him not as a symbol, but as a person worthy of quiet admiration. Fans dug into Reeves's past. They remembered how he once gave up millions of dollars from his Matrix salary so the stunt and special effects teams could get a fairer share. How he's been seen riding the subway alone, carrying his own bag, holding doors for strangers. How he never talks about his tragedies, the death of his newborn daughter, the loss of his partner in a car crash, but carries them with a grace that speaks louder than words. And now this, a nod to a humble priest who'd just taken on one of the heaviest roles in the world, not with fanfare but with prayer and silence. The contrast was striking. Two men from opposite ends of the globe, different lives, different callings, but both known, above all, for how they treat people when no cameras are watching. By morning, the story had legs, not because it was scandalous or dramatic, but because it felt like a breath of fresh air. In a time when headlines are often filled with outrage, division, and noise, this small moment offered something else. Calm, respect. A reminder that goodness still exists, and that noticing it matters. Even religious leaders took note. A bishop in Chicago mentioned the interview during Sunday Mass, not to convert anyone, but to highlight how unexpected voices can point us toward light. Sometimes, he said, truth comes from places we don't expect. Back in Los Angeles, Reeves had already left the studio. He was probably asleep, or reading a book, or fixing a motorcycle in his garage, doing the quiet things he's always done. He likely had no idea his words would ripple so far, but that's the thing about sincerity. It doesn't need amplification to be powerful. It just needs to be real. And in that late-night studio, under soft lights and quiet curiosity, something real had happened. Not a performance, not a stunt, just a man acknowledging another man's quiet dignity, and in doing so, reminding everyone watching that the world still has room for humility, for respect, for simple human decency. The film he was promoting? It would open next month. But for now, people weren't talking about special effects or plot twists. They were talking about a 5-second pause, a name spoken gently, and the strange, beautiful way one honest sentence can echo across the world. And somewhere, in a simple room at the Vatican, a new pope, unaware of the Hollywood mention, was likely doing exactly what he'd always done, praying, listening, and serving in silence. By the next morning, the clip had already been shared more than 1 million times. It wasn't just fans of the actor who were talking about it. People who'd never seen one of his movies were pausing their morning coffee to watch a 30-second video of him saying something kind about the new pope. There was no drama, no controversy, no flashy editing. Just a man speaking quietly on a couch, and yet it felt like a splash of cold water in a world that had grown used to shouting. On social media, the reactions poured in like rain after a long drought. Some joked, "Keanu Reeves out here casually blessing the Pope like it's Tuesday." Others were more thoughtful. "He didn't say much, but I felt it in my chest," one person wrote. A teacher posted, "Played this for my students today. We talked about what it means to respect someone you've never met, just because of how they live." Even people who didn't follow religion found something in it, a sense of calm, a reminder that not every public figure is chasing attention. News outlets, always hungry for angles, scrambled to make sense of it. "Why Keanu?" asked one headline. Another tried to dig deeper. Is Hollywood turning to faith? But the truth was simpler. There was no grand shift, no secret conversion. Just one person noticing another person's quiet integrity, and saying so without fanfare. Religious commentators were careful not to overstate it. "He didn't endorse a doctrine," said a theologian on a morning radio show. "He honored equality, humility, and that's something anyone can understand regardless of belief." Others pointed out that Reeves had never claimed to be religious. In past interviews, he'd spoken about spirituality in broad terms, about connection, about trying to be good, but never aligned himself with any church or creed. That made his comment even more striking. It wasn't about faith as a label. It was about character as a compass. Meanwhile, in newsrooms across Europe and Latin America, reporters began looking into Pope Robert Prevost's background. Who was this man that a global movie star would mention so sincerely? They found a story far removed from red carpets and paparazzi. Born in the American Midwest, Prevost had joined a religious order as a young man and spent most of his life far from the spotlight, first as a teacher, then as a missionary in Peru, where he lived in small villages, learned local languages, and worked alongside farmers and laborers. He wasn't known for fiery sermons or viral quotes. He was known for showing up and staying. Photos surfaced of him kneeling in muddy fields, sharing meals with families who had little to spare, listening more than speaking. One image taken years ago showed him repairing a roof with a group of teenagers, his hands covered in dust, his face calm. There was no press release, no stage photo op, just work, just presence. And now, this quiet life had brushed against one of the most visible lives on the planet, and the collision had created a spark. Online, strangers began sharing their own stories. A nurse wrote about a patient who'd thanked her with tears in his eyes after a long shift. A bus driver described how a teenager had given up his seat for an elderly woman without being asked. "We're surrounded by quiet goodness," someone posted. "We just forget to notice it." The thread grew longer, warmer, less about celebrities or popes and more about the everyday acts of decency that usually go unseen. Even skeptics softened. "I don't care about the Pope or Hollywood," one user admitted. "But I liked how he said it, like he meant it, not like he was trying to get likes." That was the thread tying it all together. Authenticity. In an age where every word can feel curated for reaction, this moment felt unguarded, human. Back in Los Angeles, the actor had already moved on. He was on set by sunrise, rehearsing lines, adjusting his jacket, joking with the crew. He hadn't posted about the interview, hadn't given follow-up comments. He likely didn't even check his phone much. That was part of why people trusted him, because he never seemed to be playing a role off screen. The Vatican, for its part, stayed quiet. No official statement, no social media post quoting the interview, but behind the scenes, aides noted the unusual wave of interest. Requests for information about the new pope doubled overnight. Bookstores reported a spike in orders for his old writings, simple reflections on service, community, and silence. Even secular readers were curious. "I just want to understand what Keanu saw," one customer told a clerk. What made the moment stick wasn't fame or theology. It was resonance. People were tired of performance, tired of outrage, tired of being told that the only way to matter was to be loud, flashy, or divisive. Here was proof that quiet strength still moves people, that respect offered freely can travel farther than criticism ever could. In classrooms, teachers used the clip as a writing prompt. Describe someone you admire for their actions, not their fame. In therapy offices, counselors mentioned it as an example of healthy admiration, looking up to someone not because they're perfect, but because they try. Even in offices and factories and grocery stores, people brought it up in passing. "Did you hear what Keanu said?" Became a kind of shorthand for, remember that there's still good out there. And slowly something shifted, not in policy or politics, but in mood. A softening, a pause, like when a room full of arguing people suddenly hears a child laugh, and for a second everyone stops and smiles without knowing why. No one expected this to change the world. But it reminded people of something they already knew deep down. That kindness doesn't need a spotlight to be powerful. That noticing someone's quiet effort is itself an act of grace. And that sometimes the most unexpected voices can point us back to what matters. By the end of the week, the headlines had moved on. To scandals, to sports, to the next big thing. But the feeling lingered. Not as a trend, but as a quiet hum beneath the noise. Like a song you can't get out of your head. Not because it's loud, but because it's true. And somewhere in a modest room in Rome, a new pope, unaware of the Hollywood ripple, was likely doing exactly what he'd always done. Listening, praying, and showing up for people who needed him. Just as across the ocean, an actor was doing the same in his own way, working, caring, and speaking only when he had something real to say. Two lives, miles apart, echoing the same simple truth. That how you treat people when no one's watching is the truest measure of who you are. And sometimes when the world is ready to hear it, even the quietest voice can be the one that's heard the loudest. It didn't take long for people to start connecting the dots. Not in a conspiracy kind of way, but in that quiet human way we do when we sense a pattern in someone's life. After the interview clip went viral, Fans began piecing together moments from the actor's past not to prove anything, but just to understand why those few words about the new pope had felt so genuine. They remembered how, years ago during the height of his fame, he'd been spotted riding the subway alone, wearing a worn-out coat, reading a book like any other commuter. No bodyguards, no sunglasses hiding his eyes. Just a man going about his day. Then there was the story, confirmed by crew members, about how he once gave up a huge chunk of his salary on a blockbuster film so the stunt team and visual effects artists could get paid fairly. He didn't announce it. Didn't ask for credit. It only came out years later, almost by accident. And then there were the losses. The kind that hollow you out. The death of his newborn daughter just days after she was born. The tragic car crash that took his partner and left their unborn child behind. He never turned those tragedies into headlines. Never used them to sell a story or gain sympathy. Instead, he carried them with a quiet dignity that made people wonder how anyone could keep going and still be kind. He once said in a rare interview, "Grief changes you, but it doesn't have to make you hard." That line stuck with people because you could see it in how he moved through the world, patient, present, never in a rush to be seen. On the other side of the globe, the new pope's story began to unfold in similar tones. Before he wore white robes, he lived in a small room in Peru, sleeping on a thin mattress, eating simple meals, spending his days walking dusty roads to visit families who had little but gave everything. He wasn't there to convert anyone. He was there to listen, to help rebuild a school after a flood, to sit with a grieving mother long after the funeral was over. He rarely gave interviews. When he did, he spoke about accompaniment, not leading from above but walking beside people in their struggles. That word started appearing more often online after the actor's comment. People looked it up, shared it, wrote it in journals. It wasn't flashy, but it felt real. What struck people most wasn't that these two men were alike in background. They weren't. One grew up in cities, chased by cameras, shaped by Hollywood. The other chose a life of silence, prayer, and service far from the spotlight. But they shared something deeper, a belief that how you treat people when no one's watching matters more than any title you hold. Psychologists and writers began weighing in, not with jargon, but with simple observations. "We're starved for authenticity," said one commentator on a morning podcast. "We see so much performance, on screens, on stages, even in everyday life. So when someone speaks without an agenda, it cuts through the noise." Another added, "It's not about religion or fame. It's about character." And both these men have shown over decades that their character isn't for show. Even people who didn't follow either man closely found themselves reflecting. A delivery driver in Chicago said he thought about the interview while waiting at a red light. "I don't know much about the Pope," he admitted later in an online forum, "but I know what it's like to do your job quietly, hoping you're making someone's day a little easier." And hearing someone famous honor that, it felt like being seen. That was the thread running through it all, being seen. Not for your achievements, not for your platform, but for your effort. For showing up day after day even when it's hard, even when no one claps. Schools started using the moment in unexpected ways. A high school teacher in Oregon played the clip during a lesson on ethics. "Who do you admire?" she asked her students. Not who's famous, but who lives in a way that makes you want to be better. The answers weren't celebrities or influencers. They were parents who worked double shifts, coaches who stayed late to help kids, nurses who held patients' hands when they were scared. The actor and the Pope had become symbols, not of perfection but of persistence, of choosing kindness even when the world feels chaotic. And that resonated because it was something anyone could do. You didn't need millions of followers. You didn't need a title. You just needed to pay attention and care. There was also something comforting in the fact that neither man sought this attention. The actor hadn't mentioned the Pope to get praise. The Pope hadn't changed his life to become famous. They were both just living the way they believed was right, and somehow that quiet consistency had become its own kind of light. People began sharing small acts they'd witnessed or done themselves. A stranger paying for someone's coffee, a neighbor shoveling snow without being asked, a teen helping an elderly person carry groceries. These stories didn't go viral, but they were shared in group chats, in letters, in quiet conversations over dinner, and each one felt like a reply to that original moment on the couch. Yes, this matters. What made the whole thing so powerful wasn't the fame or the position, It was the humanity. Two men shaped by different paths echoing the same truth, that a life lived with humility and care leaves ripples even if you never see them, and maybe that's why the moment stuck. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. Deep down, everyone knows what it feels like to try to be good in a world that often rewards the opposite, to keep going even when you're tired, to offer kindness without expecting anything back. In the end, the actor didn't need to explain himself. The Pope didn't need to respond. Their lives had already spoken, through decades of quiet choices, small gestures, and consistent care. And sometimes that's enough, more than enough. Because in a world full of noise, the quietest voices are often the ones that echo the longest. There was never any proof they'd met. No photo, no letter, no shared event in some quiet corner of the world. And yet, as the days passed and people kept talking about that brief mention during the interview, a strange feeling settled in. That these two men, so far apart in role and routine, were somehow speaking the same language without ever having practiced it together. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about fame. It was about something quieter, deeper, how you move through the world when you think no one is watching. The actor had spent decades doing exactly that, showing up, helping, listening, never demanding the spotlight. The Pope had done the same, only in cassocks instead of leather jackets, in chapels instead of film sets. But the heart of it was the same. People began to notice the parallels not as coincidence but as confirmation. Both had chosen paths that asked for sacrifice. Both had faced loss, personal, painful, the kind that reshapes your bones. Both had been thrust into roles that came with expectations they never asked for. And both had responded not with grand speeches but with steady presence. One detail surfaced quietly, almost by accident. Years ago, long before any of this, the actor had made a donation to a Catholic aid organization that worked with displaced families in Central America. It wasn't publicized. There was no press release, no photo op. It only came to light because a retired staffer mentioned it in an old interview, recalling how the gift had arrived with no note, just a simple transfer and a request that it go directly to those in need. At the time, no one connected it to anything. But now, looking back, it felt like a thread, faint, but there. The Pope, for his part, had spent much of his early ministry in that same region, not in grand cathedrals, but in villages where running water was a luxury and hope was rationed like food. He'd learned to speak the local dialects, not to preach, but to understand. He'd sat on dirt floors, shared beans from a common pot, and stayed long after others had left. His leadership wasn't about authority, it was about accompaniment. Walking beside people, not ahead of them. That word, accompaniment, started showing up everywhere. In sermons, yes, but also in blogs, in workplace trainings, even in parenting forums. What if we stopped trying to fix people, one post read, and just walked with them? It wasn't a new idea, but hearing it echoed by two very different lives gave it weight. Experts tried to explain it, but the truth was simpler than analysis. People were hungry for examples of integrity that didn't come with a sales pitch. In a time when every public figure seemed to be selling something, themselves, a product, a cause, here were two men who seemed to want nothing more than to serve. Not for applause. Not for legacy. Just because it was right. And that's what made the connection feel real, even without direct contact. It wasn't about them knowing each other. It was about them reflecting the same values back to the world, like two mirrors facing each other, creating an endless corridor of quiet decency. In living rooms and coffee shops, people talked about what that kind of life looked like in their own worlds. A nurse said she thought of it during a night shift, holding the hand of a patient whose family couldn't be there. A teacher remembered it when she stayed late to help a struggling student, not because it was required, but because she saw the spark in them. A mechanic recalled how he'd fixed a single mom's car for free last winter, just so she could get to work. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I did it because it felt like the right thing." And now, hearing about these two guys, it's like, yeah, that's enough. That was the quiet revolution happening beneath the headlines. A return to the idea that goodness doesn't need recognition to be meaningful. That showing up for others, consistently, quietly, without fanfare, is its own reward. Even in places where faith wasn't part of daily life, the message landed. Because it wasn't really about doctrine, it was about humanity, about choosing empathy over ego, service over status, And in a world that often feels transactional, that choice feels radical. The Vatican never issued a statement about the actor's comment. But during a small gathering with local priests a week later, the Pope was asked about it. He smiled, not the polished smile of a public figure, but the soft, tired smile of someone who spent a lifetime listening. "If my work reminds even one person to be kinder," he said, "that is grace enough." No mention of Hollywood. No praise or dismissal, just gratitude that the message had traveled. Back in Los Angeles, the actor was back on set, doing what he always did, focusing on the work, treating the crew like family, carrying his own coffee in a paper cup. He hadn't posted about the interview, hadn't given follow-ups. He likely didn't even know how far his words had gone, and that was part of why people trusted them. He wasn't performing. He was just being. What made their stories so compelling wasn't perfection. It was persistence. The actor had made mistakes, faced criticism, weathered public scrutiny. The Pope had navigated complex church politics, made tough calls, carried the weight of an ancient institution. Neither claimed to have all the answers, but both kept trying, day after day, to live in a way that honored something greater than themselves. And maybe that's the real connection. Not a meeting, not a shared cause, but a shared commitment to keep showing up even when it's hard. To believe that small acts matter, to treat people like they're worth your time, your attention, your care, simply because they exist. In the end, the world didn't need them to be heroes. It just needed them to be human. And in their quiet, consistent way, they were. That's why the moment stuck. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. And truth, even whispered, has a way of finding its way into the hearts of those who are ready to hear it. Weeks passed. The headlines moved on as they always do. New movies dropped. New controversies flared. New faces filled the screens. The clip of the actor mentioning the Pope still lived online, shared now not as breaking news but as something quieter, like a favorite song you return to when the world feels heavy. It wasn't trending anymore, but it was still there, tucked into playlists titled "Moments That Restored My Faith in People" or "When Kindness Went Viral." And in that shift, from headline to heartbeat, something important happened. The moment stopped being about two famous men and started being about everyone else. Teachers began using it in classrooms, not to teach religion or celebrity culture, but to talk about integrity. What does it mean to do the right thing when no one's watching? They'd ask. Students would write essays about parents who worked overnight shifts, coaches who stayed late to listen, neighbors who shoveled snow without being asked. The actor and the Pope became symbols, not of perfection but of persistence, of showing up day after day even when it's hard. Podcasts picked it up too. Not the flashy ones chasing clicks, but the small, thoughtful shows where hosts spoke softly about meaning, loss, and everyday courage. One episode opened with the clip, then spent an hour talking about how rare it is to see public figures honor quiet virtue without turning it into a performance. "We don't need more heroes on pedestals," the host said. "We need more reminders that ordinary goodness changes the world." Even workplaces felt the ripple. A manager in a mid-sized company started ending team meetings with a simple question. "Did anyone notice someone doing something kind this week?" At first, people were quiet, but soon, stories came out about someone covering a shift, sending a note of encouragement, staying late to help a colleague meet a deadline. It wasn't grand, but it was real, and it started with a 5-second pause on a late-night couch. The Vatican never made a big deal of it. No press conference, no official quote beyond that one gentle remark. But inside churches and community centers, the new Pope's early messages, about listening, about walking with the forgotten, began to circulate more widely. Not as doctrine, but as invitation. "You don't have to be perfect to care," one priest said during a Sunday service. "You just have to show up." Meanwhile, the actor returned to his life as if nothing had changed. He rode his motorcycle through quiet streets, visited small bookstores, showed up on set before sunrise. He didn't post about it, didn't explain it. He just kept living the way he always had, kind, present, unassuming. And that consistency, more than any statement, spoke volumes. Because in the end, people weren't moved by what he said about the Pope. They were moved by the fact that he meant it, and that he'd spent a lifetime proving it. One afternoon, in a subway car in Toronto, a young man scrolled through his phone. He'd had a rough week, missed a deadline, argued with a friend, felt like he was falling behind. Then he saw the clip again, shared by someone he barely knew. He watched it twice. The second time he looked up. An elderly woman stood near the doors holding a grocery bag with trembling hands. Without thinking, he stood and offered his seat. She smiled, eyes tired but warm. "Thank you, dear," she said. He nodded, stepped back, and held the pole as the train rattled forward. No one filmed it. No one posted it. But in that small exchange, something passed between them. Not just a seat, but a quiet understanding. That kindness doesn't need an audience. It just needs to happen. That's where the real story lived. Not in studios or cathedrals, but in moments like this. In kitchens where someone makes tea for a grieving friend. In offices where a coworker stays late to help. In parks where strangers share a bench and a silence that feels like peace. The actor and the Pope never met. They likely never will. But their lives, in their own ways, pointed to the same truth. That the world is changed not by loud declarations, but by consistent care. Not by being seen, but by seeing others. And maybe that's why the moment lasted. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. Deep down, everyone knows what it feels like to try to be good in a world that often rewards the opposite. To keep going even when you're tired. To offer kindness without expecting anything back. In schools, students still talk about it. In churches, it's mentioned in passing. Online, it's shared not for likes, but for comfort. It became less of an event and more of a compass. A quiet reminder of what matters when everything else feels noisy. The film the actor had been promoting opened to modest success. Critics called it thoughtful, understated, human. It didn't break records. But people left the theater feeling seen. And maybe that was the point all along. As for the Pope, he continued his work. Visiting hospitals, meeting with refugees, writing letters to young people who'd lost hope. He didn't mention the interview again. He didn't need to. His life was already the message. And somewhere in cities and towns and quiet corners of the world, people kept doing what they'd always done. Helping, listening, showing up. Not because they saw a clip or read a headline, but because it's who they are. Sometimes the most powerful statements aren't made to change the world, but to remind it of what it already knows. That goodness exists, that it's quiet, that it doesn't need a spotlight to be real, and that in the end is enough.